After reading through countless creepy, odd, and downright horrifying campsite stories, I felt the need to add my own. This is my experience, and I want to emphasize something that many others here have already stated. Humans are, by far, the most dangerous animal you can encounter in the woods. Let me take you back to March 2008. I was new to bikepacking, but had been camping in Colorado my whole life. I'd heard about the Colorado Trail and had decided to give it a go. The plan was to ride the entire trail, all 535 miles of it. But for now, I was tackling the first segment on my bike. The idea of being able to bike out of my front door in Littleton and find myself deep in the woods within 45 minutes was exhilarating. The weather was unseasonably warm for March, with a spring-like feeling in the air. I was eager to test out my ultralight backpacking and bikepacking gear. I had spent weeks researching, preparing, and attending free advanced mountain bike maintenance classes. I had all the tools, all the right layers, and the right attitude. I was ready. The first few times were simple enough, short, one-night trips camping on segment 1 of the trail. The trailhead was close to home, so it seemed like a no-brainer. But solo camping in the Colorado wilderness, especially in March when snow still blanketed many areas, was not without risks. I took every precaution. I hung my food, kept a small fire away from my tent, washed my hands thoroughly before getting close to my sleeping area, and even carried bear mace, a tactical fixed-blade knife, and a jogging alarm that screamed at 130 dB when pulled. I had a bell on my bike frame, too. I wasn't taking any chances. On this particular trip, I was excited. It was the 5th or 6th time I had gone up there. After weeks of snow and mud, a warm St. Patrick's Day week had finally opened up new sections of the trail. I checked and rechecked my gear, made sure I had enough layers in case the temperature dipped into the teens, and headed out. Riding through the trail, past Bear Creek, I marveled at how pristine everything felt. The single track was dry, the birds were chirping, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm glow over everything. But as I rounded a corner just past Bear Creek, I saw something strange. A full suspension trek bike leaning against a tree. I didn't think much of it at first, but I had to wonder why it was left there. I pushed forward, curious. 100 yards ahead, I heard the sound of a hand saw cutting through wood. The trail curved, and soon I could see a man in his mid-50s, wearing a flannel shirt, jeans, and long brown hair, sawing a fallen tree off the trail. He smiled when he saw me. "Hey there," he greeted. "I've been riding this trail for decades. Come up here every spring to clear out the trees." He seemed friendly enough, so I jumped off my bike and helped him haul the pieces of the tree out of the way. He had already done the cutting. We chatted while working, and he asked about my bike and my trip. In hindsight, I told him way too much. I told him I was new to the trail, where I was camping, that I didn't have any weapons on me, and that I was alone. He seemed genuinely interested, but I should have been more cautious with the information I shared. He mentioned a campsite half a mile up the trail that had a fire pit and was sheltered from the wind by cliffs. Sounded perfect for the night. I thanked him and followed his directions. When I arrived at the spot, it was as described. Beautiful, tucked away, with a breathtaking view of Waterton Canyon. The fire pit was in good condition, and there was plenty of wood nearby. I set up my tent, and soon after, I found the tools the man had mentioned hidden under a cliff ledge. A handsaw, a hatchet, a hammer. Everything I would need to gather firewood for the night. I spent the evening cooking a dehydrated meal, enjoying some cherry cobbler, and relaxing by the fire. The peacefulness of the place, the quiet, the stars in the sky, all of it made me feel safe, comfortable even. I'd been camping in Colorado for years, but this felt different. As I sat by the fire, the sounds of the forest seemed to lull me into a sense of security. After cleaning up, I crawled into my tent, eager for a good night's sleep. I had started carrying earplugs on these trips because the first few nights alone in the woods had been unnerving. But now, I was used to the sounds of the forest, the occasional rustle of leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the distant calls of coyotes. I woke suddenly. Something wasn't right. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my heart raced. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't a noise or anything specific, but I felt like something was off. I fumbled for my headlamp, popped my head out of the tent, and scanned the darkness. Nothing, just the quiet, still night. I told myself it was nothing, probably just the wind, or maybe an animal moving through the woods. But I didn't feel reassured. It was unnervingly still. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just complete silence. I grabbed my bare mace and knife, stepped out of the tent, and kept my eyes trained on the forest around me. I stood there, listening, the adrenaline pumping through my veins. After a minute, I felt an overwhelming sense of fear, like something was watching me. I could feel it in my bones. I grabbed my personal jogging alarm and yanked the pin. The 130 dB scream pierced the silence, and I waited. Nothing. The forest was still. Yet, something deep inside me screamed that I wasn't alone. I took my time packing up, carefully stowing away my gear. Every movement felt like it was being observed, and every noise, every crack of a twig, made my heart jump in my chest. Took me what felt like forever to get everything packed. I wasn't thinking straight, but I knew I had to leave. Whatever it was, I had to get out of there. Once packed, I hopped on my bike and started riding. The trail was steep, and my bike felt heavier than ever with 23 pounds of gear on it. I tried to keep calm, but fear surged through me with every pedal stroke. I was so focused on just getting out of there that I barely noticed the moon above me, casting long shadows along the trail. Then I heard it. Someone was walking just off to my right. It was close, too close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the unmistakable crunch of twigs and the rustle of leaves, but I couldn't see anything. I squeezed the handlebars, my knuckles white. Then, it shifted like whatever it was adjusting its stance, preparing to move again. My breath hitched. I was certain it wasn't an animal. It sounded too deliberate, too human. "Get the fuck out of here, motherfucker!" I yelled into the night, my voice cracking with fear. "I will cut your fucking throat." I heard the thing move again, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it seemed to shift closer, just out of my line of sight. "Yo, bear!" I yelled repeatedly, hoping to scare whatever it was away. I pushed harder, my legs burning as I pedaled uphill. Sweat dripped from my forehead, mixing with the fear that was now coursing through me. The sound of footsteps, human-like footsteps, was still there, close. Every few minutes, I had to get off my bike and push, too steep to ride. But every time I stopped, I heard it again, rustling, shifting, following me. Finally, after what seemed like forever, I reached Lenny's Rest. I stopped, my heart racing, and leaned against the bench to catch my breath. And then I heard it, something running up the hill behind me, fast. It was too loud to ignore, too fast to be just a small animal. This thing was charging up the trail toward me. My entire body screamed at me to run, but I had no idea what the hell was coming after me. I couldn't wait anymore. I bolted down the trail, picking up speed, carving through the switchbacks as fast as I could. The trail was treacherous, and I could feel the cliff edges lurking just out of sight. I didn't care. I didn't think. I just rode. The fear of whatever was behind me pushed me harder than I'd ever ridden before. At one point, I had to slow down to navigate a particularly rocky section. I got off my bike, carefully walking it around the boulders. And then, just then, I heard it, crashing through the trees above me, bypassing the trail completely. Whatever it was coming straight down the mountain, heading right for me. I jumped back on my bike and gave it everything I had. Down, down, down the mountain, through the switchbacks and the rocks, my heart thundering in my chest. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. Finally, I hit Wadsworth Boulevard, the city lights in the distance like a beacon of safety. My hands were shaking, my body drenched in sweat, but I was alive. As I stood there, my bike in hand, I realized how close I had come to something. Someone out there in the woods, and I would never forget the feeling of being watched, of knowing that whatever it was still there, waiting. Growing up in the Rockies was a unique experience, one that molded me in ways I'm still trying to understand. My parents had 35 acres of secluded land, nestled deep within the mountain range, 2 to 3 hours away from our town. It wasn't just property. It was a second home, a place where we felt more alive than anywhere else. The mountains were in my blood. My parents had both grown up in the wilderness, learning the rhythms of the forest from a young age. They were seasoned campers, experienced in all things survival, and they had raised my brother and me with that same mindset. Camping trips to the property were frequent, and we would spend weekends there in the spring and summer months, sometimes even in the fall if the weather held up. The land was rich with dense pine forests, jagged rocks, clear streams, and fields of wildflowers. There were areas where you could feel the old, untouched energy of the land, a kind of wild, untamed spirit that never quite let go. It felt like the mountains were alive, as though they had seen so much in their time, and maybe they were still watching. This particular time we went up, we arrived late at night. It was around 9 or 10 p.m. when we finally made it to the property. The sky was ink black, speckled with stars, and there was a chill in the air that made you pull your jacket tighter around you. We were all tired from the long drive, our eyes heavy and limbs sore from being cramped in the car. But there was something about being out there that made you forget all of that. The excitement of setting up camp under the vast, open sky was enough to shake off the weariness. As soon as we stepped out of the car, though, there was something off. It wasn't just the usual crisp mountain air. It was thicker, somehow. The kind of air you could feel pressing against your skin. It didn't take long for all of us to notice that something was wrong. It was dead silent, not a single sound. No rustling leaves, no crickets or birds in the distance. Nothing. The mountains, which were usually filled with the symphony of nature at night, were eerily quiet. I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. I wasn't the only one. My mom looked around, her sharp eyes scanning the trees. My dad frowned, glancing back toward the car as though to reassure himself that we hadn't missed something important. It wasn't just the lack of noise, it was a feeling, a heaviness, like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something. "It's just the time of year," my dad said, though his voice lacked the usual calm confidence. "Let's get the tents set up." We laughed it off, even though we all knew deep down that this wasn't just a typical quiet night in the woods. Still, we moved to work, unpacking gear and setting up the tents. As we began working, the uneasy feeling didn't subside. If anything, it grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that we were being watched. Not from any particular direction, but from all around us. The trees, the shadows, the dark spaces between them. Something was out there. The first odd sound came from above. At first, I thought it was just the wind stirring the branches. But then it happened again, louder this time. Something moving high up in the trees, much higher than a bird could fly. The sound was unmistakable. Something heavy, something with weight, crashing through the branches like a monkey swinging from tree to tree. But that couldn't be right. We had never seen anything like that out here. Raccoons didn't move like that. They didn't jump from tree to tree with such clumsy abandon. And we didn't have monkeys in the Rockies. The rustling continued, louder and more frequent, as though multiple creatures were moving through the canopy above us. My heart raced as I stared up into the trees, trying to make sense of it. but all I saw were the dark silhouettes of branches swaying in the wind. "Did you hear that?" I whispered to my brother, who was crouching next to me, his face pale. He nodded, his eyes wide, but he didn't speak. Neither of us knew what to say. Our parents were still outside, setting up the campfire and making sure everything was in order. I remember how they both looked up toward the sound, their faces etched with confusion. Normally, they would have brushed it off as a squirrel or a bird, but this was different. "We should head inside," my mom called out, her voice tight. "You two stay in the tent." We obeyed, knowing better than to question her. My mom was tough, tougher than anyone I knew. She had once stalked a bear to get a good picture and had no fear of the wild. But there was something in her voice that told me she was on edge, something I hadn't heard before. I watched them as they stepped away, flashlights cutting through the darkness. They moved cautiously, looking around, but there was nothing. Just the trees, the shadows, and the unsettling silence that hung in the air. Inside the tent, my brother and I huddled together, listening to the rustling getting louder. It wasn't just in one direction anymore, it was all around us. It felt like whatever was out there was moving in a circle, surrounding us. The trees creaked and groaned as though they were under pressure, and the strange sounds began to take on a rhythm, almost like communication. It was as though someone was calling out, waiting for a response. And then the calls came. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't a typical owl or coyote. It was something else entirely. It was primal, almost human sounding, like a scream, but with an odd hollowness to it. It almost sounded like a human trying to mimic the screech of some kind of primate, but distorted, unnatural. The noise echoed across the forest, and then another call answered from the opposite direction, followed by another and another, surrounding us from all sides. My heart pounded in my chest, the hairs on my arms standing straight up. I had never heard anything like this before, and neither had my parents. The calls continued, getting louder, more frantic. I could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on us, the feeling of being surrounded, trapped in a place where nature itself felt wrong. My parents returned to the tent, their faces pale, their bodies tense. They had nothing to report, no sign of any animals or people. Just the same eerie quiet, the strange rustling, and the impossible calls. "We need to stay in here for now," my dad said, his voice low and steady, though I could see the unease in his eyes. "Stay quiet. We'll figure this out." We stayed there in silence, the sounds outside continuing their relentless chorus. The dogs, usually brave and protective, were huddled together in the corner of the tent, trembling. The entire situation felt wrong. Everything about it was wrong. At one point, my dad couldn't stand it anymore. He unzipped the tent, his flashlight flicking on. The second the light pierced the dark, the sounds stopped. Just like that. No more rustling. No more calls. The forest fell completely silent again, as though the entire world had pressed pause. He stepped outside cautiously, his footsteps barely making a sound on the forest floor. My mom followed him, her flashlight bouncing in the dark. They both moved through the trees, searching for something, anything that could explain the bizarre noises we had just experienced. But they found nothing. The forest was still. Only fallen branches and strange marks on the trees greeted them. They came back to the tent after what felt like hours, trying to reassure us, though I could see the doubt in their eyes. "We're going to be okay," my dad said, though I could tell he wasn't sure. Somehow, we managed to fall asleep, the sound of the forest outside now impossibly still. The next morning, the air felt different, cleaner, somehow as if the night's events had never happened. We packed up camp quickly, not daring to linger in the place any longer than necessary. But we still talk about that night to this day. We never found an explanation for what we heard or why the forest had felt so wrong. Over the years, I've come to accept that sometimes there are things in the wilderness that we can't explain. Not everything has an answer, and some experiences leave you with more questions than clarity. That night, the forest was alive in ways I'll never fully understand. But one thing is certain, something was out there. Something that made us question everything we thought we knew about the wilderness. And to this day, when I hear the wind through the trees, or when the forest falls silent around me, I remember that night. I remember the feeling of being watched, the strange, unexplainable sounds, and the way the world seemed to hold its breath. And I can't help but wonder what we missed, what we never saw, and what's still out there in the deep, dark woods. The idea of venturing alone into the wild, far from civilization, has always appealed to me. I've never been one for crowds or city life. There's a peace I find in the outdoors, something primal that stirs when I'm surrounded by nothing but trees, mountains, and silence. Of course, there's also an edge to it, a danger that keeps me on my toes. Animals have always been the risk I prepare for most, but it's people who've given me the stories that still make me shiver. It was late summer in 2005 when I took a trip to a ghost town in the mountains of western Colorado. The drive there had been uneventful at first. The road, steep and narrow, wound its way up through dense forests and rocky cliffs. I knew from my map that the road ended at the old mining town, now long deserted. My plan was simple: hike a few miles beyond the town into the woods, set up camp, and spend a couple of days exploring. It was the kind of solitude I loved. As I climbed higher into the mountains, my car started to struggle. The engine temperature gauge crept up dangerously close to red. I kept my eye on it, hoping I could reach the town before it gave out entirely. The last stretch was nerve-wracking, but I managed to pull into the grassy clearing that marked the old town site just as the engine temperature hit its peak. I turned off the engine and stepped out, greeted by the sharp, cool mountain air. The town was nothing more than a scattering of ruins. Crumbling stone foundations, the remains of log cabins, and rusted debris from the mining days. A small graveyard, its wooden markers worn and tilted, stood on the edge of the clearing. It was eerily quiet, save for the occasional whisper of wind through the trees. After popping the hood, I assessed the damage. The car wasn't destroyed, but it was overheated and needed time to cool down. My original plan to camp farther into the woods was on hold. For now, I'd have to let the car sit and hope it would make it back down the mountain later that night. It was downhill most of the way, so rolling back to town was my backup plan. I spent the next few hours wandering the town site, soaking in the history. It felt strange to walk where people had once lived, worked, and died, now reduced to silence and decay. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature had dropped significantly, and the clearing was bathed in an orange glow. That's when I heard it, the unmistakable sound of a car engine approaching. I turned toward the sound, surprised. This road wasn't on the way to anywhere, it ended here. Who else would be driving up here, especially at dusk? I watched as a beat-up white Honda Civic bounced up the rutted road and pulled to a stop next to my car. The engine cut off, and for a moment, everything was still. The driver stepped out. A man in his late 30s or early 40s, with a scruffy beard and a look that immediately set me on edge. His clothes were dirty, his jeans torn, and his flannel shirt looked like it hadn't been washed in weeks. Despite his rough appearance, he didn't seem threatening at first glance, just off. He asked if I needed help, and I explained my car trouble. He nodded, listening quietly, and told me he was a miner, living out of his car after an injury left him unable to work. He said he'd been moving around the mountains for years, sleeping wherever he could find shelter. Then he mentioned an abandoned cabin near an old mine about a mile from where we stood. He planned to stay there for a few days and offered to show me the spot. I hesitated. Something about him made me uneasy, but he seemed harmless enough, just down on his luck. I agreed, reasoning that I could always refuse to stay if the cabin didn't feel right. I grabbed my pack from the car, making sure to include my .44 Magnum revolver. I kept it loaded for defense against animals, though I hoped I'd never need it. As I slid it onto my belt, the man's eyes widened. "What's the gun for?" he asked, his tone wary. "Self-defense," I replied. "Just in case I run into something bigger than me out here." That seemed to satisfy him. He gave a small nod and we started walking. The trail was narrow and uneven, winding through dense pines. As we walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. He kept glancing at me, his movements twitchy, like he was weighing something in his mind. I stayed alert, making a mental note to keep my distance. When we reached the cabin, it was just as he described. Weathered but intact, with a cast iron stove inside and piles of trash scattered around. Nearby was the mine, marked by a rusted steel derrick and a dark, yawning shaft that disappeared into the earth. He claimed the shaft was 700 feet deep, and we spent some time dropping rocks and trash into it, listening for the faint echoes of impact far below. By the time we settled into the cabin, it was fully dark. The man lit a fire in the stove, and we shared a meal of crackers and canned fish. The atmosphere was tense but civil. We laid out our sleeping bags on opposite sides of the room. As we prepared to sleep, he asked if I'd brought my gun.
No, primelit.
I left it in the car. In reality, I had the revolver under my pillow, loaded and ready. His question had only heightened my unease. Why would he care whether I had it or not? The night was cold, the fire dimming as the hours passed. I woke in the middle of the night to a strange sensation, the kind that sets every nerve on edge. The cabin was nearly pitch black, but I could make out the faint outline of the man sitting up in his sleeping bag. He wasn't moving, just sitting there watching, or so it seemed. My heart pounded as I lay still, pretending to sleep. Minutes stretched into an hour, and eventually, I must have dozed off again. Morning came with the sound of knocking. My eyes snapped open, and I saw the man looking just as startled as I felt. We exchanged a glance, both frozen. The knocking came again, sharp and deliberate. Someone or something was outside. Slowly, we crept to the windows and peered out. No one was there. A bird, pecking at the cabin walls, broke the tension. We both laughed nervously, but the unease lingered. After packing up, the man asked for help searching the woods for something he'd hidden long ago. I half-heartedly agreed, but my mind was on my car. After an hour of fruitless searching, I made my excuses and headed back to the trail. The car started without issue, and I made it down the mountain, coasting most of the way. It wasn't until I was home, unpacking my gear, that I noticed something was wrong. I opened the cylinder of my revolver to unload it and found it empty. Panic set in as I searched every pocket of my pack, my car, even the floor of my garage. The 6 rounds I'd loaded were gone, vanished without a trace. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. While I slept, the man had found my gun, unloaded it, and returned it without waking me. He'd held my life and my trust in his hands, and I never even knew it. To this day, I don't know his intentions. Maybe he was scared I'd shoot him. Maybe he wanted to ensure I couldn't use the gun against him. Or maybe, just maybe, he was weighing a decision I'll never fully understand. Years later, I saw him again in the woods, far from where we first met. He recognized me and I recognized him. He seemed more cautious, more distant. We exchanged a few words, but it was clear neither of us wanted to dwell on the past. He walked away, disappearing into the trees like a ghost. Now, when I venture into the wild, I'm more careful. I keep my gun closer, my guard higher. The mountains may be unforgiving, but it's the people you meet out there that remind you how thin the line is between safety and danger. The day had been long, and we hadn't planned on staying out as late as we had. What was supposed to be a quick hike turned into hours of wandering through thick, overgrown trails. The map we had, loaded on our phones, was showing us more green than we expected. And now, as darkness crept over the landscape, we were regretting not turning back sooner. My friend, Jake, and I had been laughing about how we were bound to get lost. But that laughter quickly faded as the trees began to thicken, and the trail became harder to follow. Our phones, low on battery, were the only source of light we had left. Both of us held our phones up like tiny beacons, their light barely making a dent in the deepening darkness. The quiet was unsettling. There wasn't even the usual buzz of insects, just the occasional crack of a branch underfoot or the distant rustle of leaves. We had been walking for what felt like hours, no sign of the campsite in sight, no familiar landmarks to reassure us. The once comforting sound of the nearby river was replaced with silence. The forest around us was vast and unbroken. As we moved forward, I felt my heart rate start to increase. My feet felt heavier with every step. "Hey!" Jake called, his voice a little more strained than usual. "You sure we're going the right way?" I glanced at my phone again, the faint glow barely illuminating the screen. It was hard to tell in the dark, but we were supposed to be close, or at least we should have been. "I don't know," I admitted, trying to keep my voice steady. "The map says we're close. Maybe just a few more minutes." I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The night felt too still, too quiet. We hadn't seen another soul for miles. No other campers, no wildlife, just the sound of our footsteps and the occasional rustle from the brush. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like you were being watched. We stumbled through a line of bushes, our phones lighting up the path ahead, and that's when we saw them. At first, it was just a flash, a glint in the distance. I thought I had imagined it. But then there was another, and another. Took a second for my brain to process what I was seeing, and then it hit me like a bucket of cold water. Dozens of them, staring at us from the depths of the darkness. I froze. My phone light shook in my hand. I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, if my mind was playing tricks on me in the dark. I thought for a moment that I had somehow wandered into a predator's territory, something that might have been waiting for an opportunity to strike. But no, as my eyes adjusted, I realized what it was. Sheep, a field of sheep, scattered across the uneven terrain, their wide, unblinking eyes reflecting the light of our phones. They were everywhere. So many of them, I hadn't even realized the field was so large. It was almost like they had materialized out of nowhere, appearing from the darkness like some kind of nightmarish illusion. I let out a shaky breath, my heart pounding in my chest. "They're just sheep," I said, the words sounding empty as soon as they left my mouth. But they were. Just sheep, right? Jake chuckled nervously, but the sound was brittle. "Yeah, just sheep. Nothing to worry about." But I wasn't so sure. Something about the way they stared at us, so still, so intense, felt off. They didn't move. They didn't shift or glance away. Every single one of them was locked onto us, as though waiting, watching. We stood there for a long moment, not moving, not knowing what to do. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the occasional creak of a branch and the soft shuffle of our feet. It was strange, the way the air seemed to grow heavier around us, like we were in a place where things didn't belong. "Let's just keep going," Jake finally said, breaking the silence. His voice was steadier than mine, but I could hear the unease underneath it. He turned, starting to walk toward the edge of the field, and I followed, both of us trying not to look back at the sea of eyes behind us. The further we walked, the more unnerving the scene became. The sheep didn't move. They didn't make a sound. Just their eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, tracking us as we moved. I could almost hear their slow, rhythmic breathing, but it was too quiet to be sure. My phone light flickered, its battery nearly dead, and we both paused to check the map again. "We're close," I said, though I didn't feel as reassured as I should have. The tent was just up ahead, or at least it should have been. But all I could see now was a thick wall of trees that seemed to close in on us. Jake muttered something, but I barely heard him. My mind was focused on the uneasy feeling growing in my chest. The sheep, the eyes, they weren't just unnerving anymore. They felt wrong, like they didn't belong here, like they were out of place, watching us with an unnatural intensity. We kept walking, our pace quickening. There was nothing left to say. Every step I took felt louder than the last, my breath coming in short bursts. I glanced back once, but I didn't see anything. The field was empty. We made it to the edge of the field, where the trees began to open up. There was the faint glow of our campsite's lantern, just visible in the distance. Relief washed over me, but the unease didn't fade. I didn't want to think about the sheep or the eyes or what it was that had made them feel so wrong. We reached the tent, and the world seemed to relax. I dropped my bag and let out a sigh, leaning against the side of the tent for support. Jake did the same, rubbing his hands over his face as if trying to shake off the lingering tension. "Just sheep?" I muttered, as if saying it out loud would make it all better. "Yeah," Jake replied, his voice less certain now. "Just sheep." We sat in silence for a long time, the only sound the rustling of the wind through the trees. There was no more movement in the field, no more eyes watching us from the dark. It was as though they had never been there at all. But the tension in the air didn't go away. Not for me, and not for Jake either. The silence between us was thick with the weight of it, the shared understanding that something had been wrong out there. But we didn't talk about it. Not that night, maybe not ever. We sat there for what felt like hours, but when I finally drifted to sleep, it was a restless one, haunted by the image of those eyes in the dark. The next morning, the sheep were gone. No trace of them anywhere in the field, no sign of any kind of disturbance. It was as if the entire event had been a dream. But I couldn't forget the way they had stared at us, the way they had watched us, as though they knew something we didn't, something we couldn't see, something that had nothing to do with the sheep at all. I didn't mention it again to Jake, and I don't think he ever mentioned it to me. We never spoke of that night, not in any real sense. But I know we both left that forest with the same uneasy feeling, the kind of feeling that never quite goes away. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is still and quiet, I can almost hear it again. The soft shuffle of hooves in the distance, the rhythmic, steady breath of something waiting, watching. But when I look out into the dark, there's nothing there, just the silence. I've been camping a lot over the years, and as anyone who spends time in the wild knows, you get used to the sights and sounds of nature. But there are things that make even the most seasoned campers stop and think, especially when you realize that the wild isn't always as peaceful as it seems. There have been a few nights that stuck with me, moments where I woke up in the dark, not sure whether to move or stay perfectly still. The kind of moments you don't forget. Like that time when I woke up to a lion just a couple feet from my head. It's strange to think back on now, but when it happened, my heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. It was a quiet night, the kind where the stars were out, and the only sounds were the wind moving through the trees. My camp was set up in a small clearing, surrounded by tall grass and a few scattered shrubs. I'd been on these kinds of trips enough to know how important it was to stay still and not make any unnecessary noise. but I'd never had an experience like this before. I remember it clearly, the rustle of something moving through the grass, soft at first, then louder as it came closer. My eyes snapped open, and I lay there, completely still, just listening. The rustling continued for a few moments, and then I heard it. A soft cough, almost like a clearing of the throat. But not from a person. This was a sound I'd heard before, but only from the big cats at the zoo. It was the kind of cough that sends a chill down your spine, and when I realized what it was, I could feel the hairs on my neck stand up. It wasn't until the coughing stopped that I realized just how close it was. I could feel the vibrations in the ground beneath me, and I slowly turned my head to the side. And there it was, a lion, no more than 2 feet from my head, just outside the thin walls of my tent. Its body was so close, I could almost feel its breath. For a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. Lions, from what I've learned over the years, tend to think of tents as solid objects. They walk right up to them without any hesitation, as if they don't even realize there's something a person might be inside of. That knowledge doesn't help much when you're wide awake. Hearing the sound of a massive animal's breathing just outside your tent, the only thing between me and it was a thin layer of nylon, and I knew that if it wanted to get inside, it could do so in seconds. I held my breath and tried to stay as still as possible. My heart was racing in my chest, and I felt the adrenaline hit me all at once. Every instinct I had was telling me to get out of there, to run, to do something, but I knew I couldn't. Not now. Not with it so close. The lion stayed there for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. I could hear it moving around, its paws patting softly on the ground. There were no growls, no sniffs, just the quiet sounds of a predator checking out its surroundings. I don't know how long it took before it finally moved off, but eventually, I heard the rustling of grass again as it stepped away from my tent. I waited for a few more minutes, still frozen in place, before I slowly exhaled. My hands were shaking, and I could feel the sweat on my forehead. It took a long while to convince myself to try and fall back to sleep. My mind was racing, and every little sound in the distance felt like it was something else moving closer. I think I eventually drifted off, but it wasn't the kind of sleep you enjoy. It was the kind of sleep where you keep waking up, checking if everything's still okay. The next morning, I packed up quickly, feeling the weight of what had happened lingering over me. I didn't want to stay in that spot any longer, and the thought of the lion being so close still had me on edge. But in a strange way, I was also fascinated. It was a reminder of just how small we are in the grand scheme of things, how easy it would be for the wild to slip past our thin defenses. But as scary as that moment was, it wasn't the only time I've had an encounter that made my heart race. There was another time when I was camping with a small crew near a village. We were set up at the edge of a small clearing, just far enough to be out of sight from the villagers, but close enough that we'd have some protection from their dogs. The village had its own system of keeping the wild animals at bay, but it didn't seem to extend to their donkeys. It was around 3 a.m., the air still and cool, and I remember waking up to the sound of something moving through the camp. At first, I thought it was just another animal, maybe a deer or something like that. But then I heard it, a bellowing noise, the kind of noise you'd expect from something huge, something that could shake the ground. But it wasn't a lion or a bear or anything else. It was a donkey. Now, you've probably never heard a donkey in heat before, but trust me, if you ever do, it'll make the hair on your neck stand up. This donkey, probably lost and looking for its herd, had wandered into our camp and was now yelling for a mate. And I swear it sounded exactly like the T-Rex from Jurassic Park. It was so loud, so piercing, that for a moment I thought the ground was going to shake. I shot up out of my sleeping bag, heart hammering in my chest. The sound of that donkey's bellowing was so close, so powerful, that I could feel the vibrations in the ground. The trees around us seemed to sway with the force of the noise, and I had a split second where I wondered if we were about to be attacked by something big, something dangerous. But then I heard it again, the bellowing donkey, and the realization hit me all at once. It wasn't a dinosaur, it was just a donkey. I don't think I've ever laughed so hard in my life. Couldn't help it. I mean, there we were, camping in the wild, and all of a sudden we were being stalked by a love-struck donkey. The whole camp woke up, and it wasn't long before everyone else started laughing too. It was a relief, honestly, after the tension of the lion encounter. Hearing that ridiculous sound was the best thing that could have happened. But as strange and funny as that moment was, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were still vulnerable. That donkey wasn't the only thing out there. There were other animals, bigger and more dangerous, that didn't care whether you were in a tent or not. And the closer I got to the edge of the wilderness, the more I realized how little protection a tent really offered. I've been camping long enough to know that the wild doesn't care about your comfort. It doesn't care that you have a campfire, a sleeping bag, or a group of friends with you. When it comes down to it, you're just another part of the ecosystem, and if something wants to get you, it will. I guess the point of all this is that camping is never as safe as you think. You can prepare as much as you want, but you never really know what's out there. You never really know what's watching you, waiting for the moment when you let your guard down. I learned that the hard way more than once, but in the end, I think it's those moments, the ones where your heart skips a beat, where you feel that primal fear, that remind you why you keep coming back. Because no matter how terrifying it gets, the wild is a place where you truly feel alive. And yeah, I've had some close calls, but I still go back. Because even though the wild can be scary, it's also beautiful. And there's something about that balance, that edge between danger and wonder, that draws you in. It's not about knowing what's going to happen next. It's about the experience itself, the feeling of being out there, surrounded by everything that's wild and free. And if you can make it through the night, you know you've earned your place in the world. It was the kind of summer night that made you want to live forever under the stars. The air was warm, the sky a deep canvas of black dotted with a million specks of light, and the world around me was buzzing with the sound of life. This was my favorite time of year. I'd spend weeks, sometimes months, away from the chaos of the world, hiking and climbing in the mountains I called my own. I never used tents. They were heavy, and in most parts of these mountains, pitching one wasn't allowed. I preferred sleeping directly under the stars, a sleeping bag my only shelter. For the most part, it was serene. Just me, the wilderness, and the occasional unsettling cries of animals that could chill your blood if you weren't used to them. But even those didn't compare to the true fear that came with encountering people out here. Animals, no matter how wild, followed predictable patterns. People, they were wild cards. It started as a casual weekend trip to a nearby lake with a group of classmates. This wasn't one of my usual deep woods expeditions. It was meant to be lighthearted, a chance to let loose with a few beers, share some laughs, and camp out by the water. This time we had tents, though I wasn't thrilled about lugging them around. As the night rolled in, the fire started to dwindle, and someone suggested gathering more wood to keep it going. My buddy and I volunteered. A short walk into the nearby woods seemed harmless enough. The path wasn't too overgrown, and the forest was dense but not suffocating. About 5 minutes in, we spotted a tent pitched just off the trail. It wasn't part of our group. This was someone else's camp. A man emerged from the tent as we passed, and we exchanged the kind of pleasantries you do when running into strangers in the wilderness. He seemed friendly enough, talking about how he'd been camping there for a few days. Then he suggested something that, in hindsight, should have raised alarm bells immediately. He pointed out 2 trails, one leading up a small incline, the other continuing along a flatter route, and suggested we split up to cover more ground. It made sense at the time, so we did. My friend took the higher path and I stayed on the lower one, though we could still see each other through the trees. I hadn't walked far when I heard my friend shout my name. I turned back, confused, and saw him pointing frantically down toward my trail. That's when I noticed the man from the tent was behind me, walking fast, a machete gleaming in his hand. He smiled when I turned around, explaining that he realized we didn't have tools to chop wood and thought he'd help. His tone was calm, his expression friendly, but everything about the situation screamed danger. I stammered out a polite decline, backing away slowly until I was near my friend. Together, we hurried back to our campsite, trying to laugh it off but failing miserably. When we got back, the others made fun of us for being paranoid. To them, it sounded like the guy was just trying to be helpful. Maybe we were overreacting. We laughed along, grabbed some beers, and tried to forget about it. Hours later, the fire was roaring again, and the mood had lightened. That's when we saw the headlamp. It bobbed through the darkness, growing brighter as it approached. It was him. He was carrying an armful of wood, smiling as he explained that he'd brought it for us since we didn't collect much earlier. That alone was unnerving, but what he did next sent shivers down my spine. Instead of dropping the wood near the fire, he wandered around our campsite, looking at our tents and casually asking if this was all of us or if more people were coming. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was memorizing the layout. No one said much. After an excruciatingly long moment, he wished us a good night and walked back into the woods. The laughter and casual chatter that had filled the air earlier were gone. We sat in silence, eyes darting toward the dark where he'd disappeared. Every little sound, the crackle of the fire, the rustle of leaves, seemed amplified. We started throwing around theories, each one darker than the last. What if he was trying to time his move based on when the fire went out? What if he wasn't alone? Someone even suggested that the occasional flashes of light from his direction could be binoculars watching us. No one slept that night. We stayed awake, rotating guard duty until the sun finally rose. Exhausted and spooked, we packed up as quickly as we could and left the lake behind. The second story is one that still gives me chills when I think about it. It happened during a climbing trip, deep in the mountains, well off any established trails. Camping there was prohibited, but we were careful to stay out of sight. The spot we found was perfect, far enough from any main paths, surrounded by thick forest, and with a clear view of the sky. After a day of climbing, we cooked a simple dinner, shared a bottle of wine, and talked until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of voices. At first, I thought I was dreaming, but the murmurs grew louder. It wasn't just one or two people. It sounded like a group, maybe 10 or more, talking quietly but animatedly. The voices were strange. They didn't have the casual tone of hikers or campers. There was an urgency to them, like they were on a mission. They passed by, distant but distinct. Then, about 5 minutes later, another group came. More voices moving in the same direction. The four of us sat up in our sleeping bags, staring at each other. No one said a word. We just listened as the second group faded into the distance. A few minutes later, we heard movement. Branches snapping, leaves crunching. Someone was coming toward us. Out of the shadows emerged 5 kids, maybe 13 years old. They walked right past our campsite, close enough to touch, nodding in silent greeting but not saying a word. None of them had flashlights, headlamps, or any source of light. The moon was bright enough to see, but it was unsettling to watch them navigate the forest so confidently in the dark. They continued in the direction of the voices, disappearing into the trees. We sat there, frozen, until the sounds of their footsteps were gone. Then we started whispering. Who were they? Why were they out here at this hour, so far off any trail and without any gear? Sleep was impossible after that. We packed up at first light, leaving behind nothing but the faint impression of our sleeping bags in the dirt. People romanticize the wilderness, painting it as this serene escape from the chaos of modern life. And sure, it can be that, but it's also unpredictable, unforgiving, and, at times, deeply unsettling. I've had my share of encounters with wildlife. Wolves howling in the distance, bears sniffing around my pack, wild boars crashing through the underbrush. But none of those compare to the fear of running into another human being out there. Because in the wild, animals act on instinct. People, you never know what they're thinking, what they're capable of, or what they want. And that uncertainty, that's the scariest thing of all. I moved to Southeast Washington for work shortly after college, looking for a change of pace and to get closer to nature. The Blue Mountains, with their rugged terrain and wide open spaces, seemed like the perfect place to learn about the land and prepare for the upcoming hunting season. As a hunter, I had always preferred solitude. There's something about being deep in the wilderness, far from roads or campsites, that makes the experience feel real. You don't get that in crowded areas where every hunter sticks to the same paths. So I took to scouting solo, heading out as far as I could from any public access points. Growing up on a farm and ranch in Montana, I was no stranger to being out in the wild. I spent most of my youth working outdoors, looking after livestock, and honing my skills in the woods. My father taught me how to hunt, how to track, and how to call animals. I'd been doing it since I was a kid, even fooling coyotes into thinking I was a dying jackrabbit when I was just 10. Over the years, I became a master at mimicking the sounds of all kinds of creatures, from rodents to bull elk, learning the subtle differences in their calls. It's not something you pick up overnight. It's a skill that comes with time, patience, and a keen ear. Not many can replicate the calls of animals like I can, especially not city folk who only dabble in it when they pick up a fancy call at the store. I was raised on these sounds, living and breathing the rural life before I even knew how to properly write my name. On this particular trip, I set out late in the afternoon to scout for game. The light was fading as I made my way up the slopes of the Blue Mountains. I hiked a couple of miles before I decided to set up camp. I wanted a vantage point that would give me a good view of the area, so I climbed up a ridge and found a small, relatively level spot to pitch my bivvy. It wasn't the most comfortable spot, but it worked. I wasn't expecting much. It was just a quick overnight camp, and I figured I'd catch some whitetails passing through before dark. I kept my camp dry, no fire, and settled in early to get some rest. The night was quiet, and I didn't see much wildlife aside from a couple of deer, but it was peaceful enough. But then, somewhere around 1 a.m., I was jerked out of my sleep by a pain in my head. It wasn't just a headache. It was this intense, pulsing pain that seemed to come in waves. It would hit hard, then fade, then come back again, each time stronger than before. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a minor discomfort, but it kept coming. I was careful about my hydration, kept a good eye on it during my hike up, but this wasn't the kind of headache dehydration would cause. Something felt wrong. As I lay there, trying to make sense of it, I started to hear something. At first, it was just a distant noise, faint but unmistakable. I froze, listening closely. It was an animal call, but it wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. My mind immediately started to race, trying to identify it. I'm no stranger to animal calls. I've spent years mimicking them, studying them. This one, though, it didn't match any of the calls I knew. It wasn't the usual chatter of birds or the familiar cries of predators. It was louder, deeper, and had a strange, hollow tone to it. I could tell right away that it was some kind of large mammal, something big. But what? My gut told me it wasn't a bear or a cougar. Those animals don't make calls like that. And it was too repetitive, too consistent, almost rhythmic. It was coming from higher up the mountainside, and it kept repeating itself over and over again. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was some bird I hadn't heard before. Washington is full of different species that I didn't grow up with, right? But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. It didn't sound like any bird I had ever heard. I just couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was large. My headache only made it harder to focus, the pain flaring up with each passing minute. Every time I tried to ignore the call. Around 2 a.m., I made a decision. The pain in my head was unbearable, and the call was driving me nuts. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed up my camp in the dark, trying to keep quiet as I gathered my gear. My head was spinning, and I felt a bit dizzy, but I knew I had to get out of there. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. I grabbed my 1911 from where I had stashed it, just to be safe. I didn't expect trouble, but out here you never know. And whatever that noise was, it didn't sit right with me. I knew there was a gated road just above my camp, one that looped back toward the main road and would lead me back to my truck. It was a longer route, but it would be easier to navigate in the dark, especially since the terrain around my camp was rough. So I started walking, heading up toward the road. The call followed me, staying high above me on the mountainside. No matter how much distance I put between myself and the source, the sound was still there, always just above me, shadowing my every step. It was as if it was watching me, waiting for me to make a move. By the time I reached the road, the call was still echoing in the distance, and my headache had begun to fade. As I dropped down out of the mountains and made my way back toward the truck, the pain was completely gone. The change in altitude seemed to help clear it up. I breathed easier now, but my mind was still racing. What the hell was that sound? What had I just experienced? When I finally made it back to my truck, I was exhausted, but I couldn't let it go. I had to know what I had heard. So, as soon as I got home, around 3 or 4 a.m., I started searching for bird calls from Washington. I went through every site I could find, listening to every recorded bird sound, but nothing came close to what I had heard. Then, just when I was about to give up, I had a nagging thought. Maybe it wasn't a bird at all. Maybe it was something else. I typed Bigfoot call into Google, almost as a joke, but what I found made my blood run cold. Within seconds, I stumbled upon an audio file labeled Bigfoot call. It was almost identical to what I had heard on that mountainside. Same deep, hollow tone, same repetitive nature. My heart started to race. There was no way it could be a coincidence. I grabbed a mouth reed just to test it, and within minutes I was able to replicate the call. It wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. I knew deep down what I had heard was no ordinary animal. I haven't been back to that spot since. I've gone back to the Blue Mountains, sure, but not to that area. I walked through it a few times, but it's a thick, dense, north-facing slope full of trees and vegetation. Even during the daytime, it's a creepy place to be, the kind of place that feels like it's hiding something. Maybe it was altitude sickness. Maybe it was just a strange animal I hadn't encountered before. But I can't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I can't explain it, and I don't think I ever will. But I know what I heard, and I'm not in any rush to find out what else might be lurking out there. I still remember the thick, wild air of Zimbabwe. It was dry but carried a certain dampness from the dense vegetation that surrounded us. My husband and I were young, too young and too inexperienced for the risks we unknowingly walked into. We were in our late 20s, both teachers in Lesotho at the time, and eager to explore the natural beauty of Africa during our breaks. We had a simple setup, a small tent, some basic supplies, and, of course, our baby girl. She wasn't even a year old yet, just beginning to explore the world in the way only a child can, with boundless curiosity and innocence. Her babbles were sweet, but as we would soon discover, they carried farther than we anticipated. Our chosen campsite was remote, in the heart of one of Zimbabwe's sprawling national parks. The scenery was breathtaking. Trees stretched endlessly, their silhouettes forming a jagged canopy against the reddening sunset. Birds called to each other in a symphony that felt almost scripted, the perfect soundtrack to a paradise untouched by human hands. But paradise has its shadows. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the world turned to shades of gray and black, we settled in for the night. Our tent was small but sufficient for the three of us, with our daughter snugly nestled between us. It wasn't the most secure arrangement, but it felt comforting to keep her close. The night was alive with sounds. Crickets chirped in a chaotic rhythm, punctuated by the occasional rustle of leaves as nocturnal creatures stirred. At first, it was soothing, a reminder of where we were and how alive the world around us was. But then came the coughing. It started faint, almost indistinguishable from the other night noises. A sharp, guttural sound, like someone clearing their throat. My husband and I exchanged glances, both silently questioning if the other had noticed it. We brushed it off, convincing ourselves it was just another harmless animal. But the coughing didn't stop. It grew louder, more frequent. It seemed to move closer. Our daughter, oblivious to the growing tension, began to coo and babble in that innocent way babies do. She was restless, her little hands reaching out to grab at the fabric of the tent or the blankets around her. And then we heard it, a second cough, and a third. The realization hit us like a physical blow. Whatever was out there wasn't alone. The coughing turned into low, guttural chuffing sounds, interspersed with the occasional sniffing. The noise was unmistakably animalistic, and there were more of them now. The tent, once our haven, felt impossibly thin, a flimsy barrier between us and whatever lurked outside. One of the creatures moved closer, its snuffling loud and wet as it inspected our campsite. I could hear the crunch of its paws on the dry earth, each step deliberate, methodical. My heart pounded in my chest, a wild rhythm that seemed to echo in the confined space of the tent. And then it sniffed the tent itself. The sound was deafening in the silence. I could feel the hot breath of the creature through the fabric, the moisture of its exhalation chilling in the cool night air. My daughter, now fully awake, let out a soft cry. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. The sniffing intensified. The animal began to paw at the ground near the base of the tent, its claws scraping against the dirt as it tried to dig underneath. My husband and I froze, paralyzed by a mix of fear and disbelief. This wasn't supposed to happen. We were supposed to be safe. Panic is a strange thing. It floods your body with adrenaline, heightening your senses and sharpening your instincts, but it also clouds your judgment. My husband fumbled around in the darkness, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. But we had nothing.
No knife, no axé, no firear.
The creature outside let out a low, rumbling growl, a sound that vibrated through the ground and into my very bones. I could hear others in the background, their coughs and chuffs forming a sinister chorus. My daughter's cries grew louder, her little body trembling with fear. The sound seemed to agitate the animals, their movements becoming more frantic. One of them began to tear at the side of the tent, its claws catching on the fabric and creating a series of tiny, jagged holes. Something snapped inside me. Maybe it was the primal instinct to protect my child, or maybe it was sheer desperation. Whatever it was, it gave me the strength to act. As the creature pressed its snout against the side of the tent, I lashed out. My fist connected with its nose, a solid, instinct-driven punch fueled by a mother's fury. The response was immediate. The animal let out a high-pitched yelp, a sound of shock and pain that echoed through the night. For a moment, everything was still, and then the entire pack scattered, their retreat marked by the frantic rustling of leaves and the pounding of paws against the earth. We didn't sleep that night. We sat in silence, our daughter cradled between us, her small body warm and reassuring. The night stretched on, each minute feeling like an eternity as we listened for any sign of the animal's return. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, we emerged from the tent. The ground around us was littered with paw prints, deep grooves where the animals had dug at the earth. The tent bore the scars of the encounter, its sides scratched and torn. But we were alive. It was a sobering experience, a stark reminder of the dangers we had so naively walked into. We packed up our campsite in silence, the weight of the night's events pressing heavily on us. As we drove away, leaving the wilds of Zimbabwe behind, I couldn't help but glance back. The landscape was beautiful, breathtaking in its raw, untamed splendor, but it was also a place of danger, a place where survival was never guaranteed. We learned a hard lesson that night, a lesson about respect, about preparation, and about the fierce, unrelenting power of nature. And though the memory of that night still sends shivers down my spine, it also reminds me of the strength we found within ourselves, a strength we never knew we had.